In this episode of the How to Japanese podcast, I'll be talking about what Ichiban Shibori, the beer, taught me about translation and how I was able to get my podcast going again thanks to a little bit of jikobunseki. The last question I ask all the guests on my podcast is, what's something you remember from your very first week in Japan? And there's a couple reasons I ask this question. One is it's just funny to see what your mind latches onto. Memory is kind of mysterious, and I'm always curious to know what someone remembers, especially during that first trip to Japan. There's so many expectations of the country, whether you've been studying the language or not. And that first week is when your expectations and reality of Japan most conflict. And that conflict leads to very interesting, vivid memories. Memory is also tied up with language. We have to remember parts of a language before we can use them as a kind of instinct. And even if you can't remember the exact content of a conversation, you can often remember how language made you feel, which leads to vivid memories. One memory I have of my first day in Japan back in 2002 is that the business hotel I was staying in near Okayama Station had a welcome beer in my room. I assume this is something they had for all guests there who were probably staying for a few days or a week, much shorter than the 2 months that I was there. This is not something I had expected of Japan. Another random memory that I seem to have latched onto also involves beer, but it comes from the first week I was on the JET program. The JET program provides an orientation for all newly arriving teachers, and it takes place in the Keio Plaza Hotel, not far from Shinjuku Station. For whatever reason, I have this memory of sitting in the Keio Plaza Hotel holding what I remember to be a fan. Not a folding fan, just one of those plastic ones that gets passed out by people advertising something. And this one happened to be sponsored by Kirin. It was an Ichiban Shibori fan, and it had this little cartoon dog on it, and the dog had this funny smile on his face that made him look tipsy, which I thought was really silly. So I pointed it out to the guy sitting next to me, who was another CIR. For those of you who don't know Japanese beer that well, Ichiban Shibori is one of Kirin's flagship beers. It's your basic Japanese macro lager, crisp and carbonated, moderately bitter, but not overwhelmingly bitter. One thing that distinguishes it from other basic Japanese beers is that it's brewed with 100% barley malt, no wheat or anything else added. And it's been brewed that way since 2009. It's one of the most widely produced beers in Japan and is more or less the Kirin equivalent of Super Dry, the best-selling beer in Japan made by Asahi. After pointing out this silly character on the fan, or what I remember to be a fan, I'm not 100% certain it was a fan. The only reason I think that is because it was August and it was hot, and it would make sense for people to be handing out fans. Whatever it was, it had this Ichiban Shibori dog on it. And after pointing it out and kind of chuckling at the dog, I realized I did not know what shiboru meant. Shiboru here is the verb that shibori comes from, shibori being the noun form of shiboru. I knew what Ichiban meant. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with this word. It means first or number one, but I did not know what shiboru meant, so I turned to the CR next to me and asked. And I vividly remember him making a motion with his hands like he was wringing out a wet cloth. So clearly it meant to squeeze, and that's what he told me. And so I kind of thought to myself, that's strange. First squeeze. That's a funny name for a beer. I kind of chalked it up to some bizarre advertising copy and then promptly forgot about it for probably 10 years. I didn't totally forget about it. Obviously, it would pop up anytime I saw Ichiban Shibori. Anytime I thought about the word shiboru, it popped up here and there, but it wasn't active memory. It was triggered whenever I saw the word or the beer. At the time, there was no reason for me to realize that Ichiban Shibori is actually an extremely appropriate name for a beer. I had less of an excuse than everyone else sitting at the Keio Plaza, though. I've actually been brewing beer myself for a very long time. Other than studying Japanese, brewing beer is one of the things in my life that I've been doing the longest. I started immediately after high school. I started again legally once I turned 21 in college, and I took it up more seriously when I moved to Chicago after grad school in 2013. Ichiban Shibori is a specific brewing term, and I would not have known about it because the type of brewing I was doing until 2013 was an abbreviated form of brewing. Brewing beer involves extracting fermentable sugars from barley. In order to do so, you crush the malted barley, soak it in hot water for about an hour, which is an involved and somewhat precarious process because the enzymes that break down the starches into fermentable sugars have very specific temperature ranges. Too hot and they'll fall apart, too cold and they just won't work. Holding the barley water mixture at this temperature for an hour requires an investment in additional brewing equipment, which makes it more expensive and means that you need more space to store the equipment, and you need to know how to use the equipment, none of which I had when I first started brewing. Before that point, I was doing extract brewing, which is buying malt extract powder or syrup, which is basically a concentrated form of these extracted sugars. It's a quick way to start brewing, it's relatively cheap, and you can finish a brew day in about an hour or two as opposed to a 5 or 6 hour brew day with all grain brewing. So in 2005, when I was starting Jet, I would not have known much about the mash, which is the process of soaking the malt at around 150 degrees. And I wouldn't have known that there were two different ways to lauter the grain bed and extract the wort. The two different methods are called fly sparging and batch sparging. I hope that you can hear the invisible quotation marks around the brewing terminology I've been throwing around. This is part of the point that I'll be making eventually. Wort is unfermented beer. Fly sparging is a continuous runoff where the brewer slowly adds additional hot water on top of the grain bed and gently rinses the sugars out of the mash and into the brew kettle. Batch sparging is what it sounds like. The brewer runs off the wort in two separate batches. After waiting an hour, they run off the first runnings, fill the mash tun with hot water again, stir it up to dissolve the remaining sugars, and then run off the second runnings. Some of you might have put two and two together by this point and realized that Ichiban Shibori, given that Ichiban means first, refers to this set of first runnings. It's actually a great name for a beer because the first runnings are thicker and sweeter than the second runnings. In British brewing tradition, the runnings are generally blended into the final beer using multiple different runnings, depending on the mash bill, but there are many beers that make use exclusively of first runnings. These are usually stronger beers like barley wines and old ales. There's also a great tradition of brewing small beers, using third and fourth runnings from the mash to produce beers like bitters and milds. Kirin is using this terminology to kind of hint and suggest to anyone understanding it that they are only using the highest quality wort for their beer. And I imagine there's probably an explanation of this somewhere on the can, so maybe they're doing a bit of consumer education in the process of selling the beer. Basically, they're trying to say that this beer hasn't been watered down or cut with second runnings. I take two lessons from this experience. The first is that translation involves senmon yogo. This is the Japanese word for specific terminology, and senmon emphasizes the specialist aspect to the terminology. If I had been asked to do a translation prior to 2013, I very well may have translated Ichiban Shibori as first squeeze, which would have been a criminal act of poor translation. I like to think that I might have done enough background research to find the terms. Obviously, Googling can sometimes offset a lack of knowledge. But at the time, I was not fluent in brewing in a way that would have been truly helpful for me as a translator and for the translation. Whatever subject you are translating, you should ideally attempt to become fluent in the subject matter. This can be frustrating because at times it means you are Googling endlessly to find a single term or usage. This is part of the job of a translator. The second lesson I take from this isn't immediately apparent, and it's not apparent because I haven't told you the official Kirin translation of Ichiban Shibori. I had a few translation projects for Kirin through an agency back in 2015, which was 2 years after I started doing all grain brewing here in Chicago. And I was really excited for these projects. I just finished self-publishing a book on how to brew beer affordably on the Kindle platform. And I remember emailing the agency and saying, hey, I just published this book. This obviously gives me credibility to take any beer translations that you're getting because obviously you're getting lots and lots of beer translations. And they said, well, actually, yes, we do have one. So that was a kind of bizarre moment where I seemingly actualized something into the world that I was looking for. And I was really excited for the project when it came in. At that point, I was a relatively successful home brewer and was more or less ready for a beer translation. And it was the eureka moment for me. I was not given a fresh translation. I was brought in along the way either because the original translator they were working with wasn't available or because they wanted somebody who was a little bit more knowledgeable about beer. I don't remember exactly what the case was. I was given an Excel file that had some cells completed and some that were not, and my job was to complete the translation. And when I saw Ichiban Shibori in the Excel file, unlike in 2005, I knew exactly what it referred to. I had mashed and sparged a beer in my kitchen. I knew exactly what the first and second runnings tasted like. I could calculate exactly how much sugar were in each of them. So when I saw that the previous translator had translated Ichiban Shibori as first press, it kind of destroyed me. That was much closer to the first squeeze I'd had in my head sitting there in the KO Plaza and pretty far from first runnings, which is basically standard industry terminology. I Googled around a little and saw that Kirin had this term already on their English website as well. That was a little frustrating and painful to see and realize, but I did what any good translator should do. I maintained their current terminology and left a comment for the agency. It wasn't my place as a freelance translator for an agency that had been contracted for this job, doing a minuscule addition to their already vast marketing copy to make them upend all the work that they'd already done. My only job was to give them clear English and make it fit with the work that they'd already done. So, other than a trip down Daniel's bizarre memory lane, I think this story provides an example of the kinds of meta-thinking that a translator needs to do on a regular basis. Obviously, this isn't literary translation. This isn't anime or manga where you're making more artistic decisions. This is your basic business translation that you'll see a lot of if you're working for agencies. Just kind of generic translation that needs to be clean. The only thing that made this special was that it happened to be a beer company and I happened to be a home brewer. With this kind of work, you need to be asking yourself questions like, is this term in regular use in the industry? What kind of language does the industry use? How are they using this word in particular? How does the industry in English-speaking countries use similar words? What language is the client currently using in their existing material? What would it take to change that? What would the effect of changing it be? And would it be worth fighting that battle? Often it is not. It is the translator's role to deliver an accurate, consistent translation with a detailed comment providing all the specialist knowledge that they have, so that the client is in the position to make the most informed decision possible. ご視聴いただきありがとうございます。せっかく日本語についてのポッドキャストを作っていますので、日本語で少し話してみないともったいないなと思いました。必ず毎回日本語で何かを録音するかどうかはまだ決めていませんが、とりあえず今回は伝えたいことがあります。まず、謝罪させていただきたいと思います。リスナーの皆さん、特にゲストの皆さん、お待たせして申し訳ありません。2年前にポッドキャストの1シーズン目を完成してすぐ2シーズン目の作業を始めました。その秋何人かのゲストにも連絡しましたが、お正月はいつもちょっと休みたい気持ちになりがちだし、仕事も忙しかったし、しかも2020年に入ってからコロナ禍が悪化したので、作業はなかなか進まなくなってしまいました。コロナ禍でストレスが溜まってきて、ストレス解放をいろいろしていましたが、ほとんどは日本語勉強以外の活動でした。パンを焼いたり、本を読んだり、自転車も買って乗ってシカゴを回っていました。9月頃やっと日本語の勉強に本格的に戻りました。日本語についてのニュースレターを書き始めて、ほぼ毎日 NHK ラジオを聞くことにもしました。ワクチン接種を受けてから不安な気持ちがある程度収まりましたが、何よりも大事なのはやっぱり自己分析でした。自分にとって何が大事なのか、暇な時間をどう過ごせば充実感を得られるのか、将来に何ができるようになりたいのか、そうなれるために今の時点ではどうすればいいのか、この質問を答えながら、つまり自己分析をしながら生きていかないとダメだと気づいたんです。自己分析できた結果、このポッドキャストが自分にとっての価値がもっとはっきり理解してきて、その理解のおかげで活動の優先順位がしやすくなりました。リスナーの皆さんも自分の優先順位がしやすくなるといいと思いますので、数分だけでもぜひ自己分析をしてみてください。Thank you for listening, and thank you especially to all the guests I contacted back in 2019 when I had just finished season 1 and was really excited to start the second season of the podcast. Again, apologies for the wait, but I'm really glad that we were able to get some of these interviews down, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the season. You can find How to Japanese on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Substack. We'll see you next week. それではまた来週。